Welcome to this edition of Tools for Living. Hi, I'm Pastor Mike, pastor of Trinity Baptist Church in Reedsburg, Wisconsin. Today we are reconvening our series in the Old Testament here at Trinity Baptist Church. And this week we're studying Numbers 13 and 14. This records the event, the pivotal event of where God's people instead of going into the promised land, choose to rebel against God and not go in. They follow their fears instead of their faith. Now, the title of this message is Trusting God Against All Odds. I'd like to encourage you right now to pause the video and read chapters 13 and 14 of the book of Numbers. Great chapter. And remember, God has just delivered them from slavery in Egypt. He's brought them out of Egypt with great and mighty acts of deliverance and miracles, brought them through the Red Sea onto Mount Sinai, and has entered into covenant with them there, and has now taken them to the brink of entering into the promised land. So now read Numbers 13 and 14. Okay, now that you've read those two chapters, wow, what a story. What a change of direction. Huge mistake on the part of God's people. And this is a good reminder for all of us. We can all make bad decisions. We all get into a place and position where we have to decide whether or not we're going to live by faith or whether or not we're going to follow our fears. Fear can keep you from following God. Fear can keep you from enjoying and experiencing the great things that God has for you. Fear does not come from God. The Bible tells us that. And so today what we're looking at is trusting God when the odds are way stacked against us. Now there are 3 or 4 things that were a problem that I've discovered from my study of Numbers 13 and 14. And here's the first one. Those leaders that were sent into the promised land and came back and gave that bad report, and the sons of Israel, the children of Israel, in their response to those leaders, the first mistake they made was this. They were not committed to God's will. They were committed to their own well-being. You know, if we want to trust God against all odds, we need to be committed to what God's will is, not to our own well-being. At the beginning of the 14th chapter, they say, "Why is the Lord bringing us into this land to fall by the sword? Our wives and our little ones will become plunder." They were afraid of being hurt. They were afraid of dying. They were afraid of being taken captive. You know, anytime God asks us to do something, it's going to involve risk. The thing the question isn't, is this dangerous? The question isn't, is this risky? The question is this God's will or not? And in this case, it was God's will for them to go into the promised land. But they were afraid of the cost. And it would cost some of them their lives. But did that make staying behind the right decision? Not at all. In the New Testament, time and time again, we're told that following Christ is risky. We don't do this seeking our own well-being. We follow Christ so that we may glorify Him and accomplish His will in this world. Spreading the gospel around the world is not in our personal best interest if we're looking out for our own well-being. It is not in anybody's personal well-being interest, bad way of saying that, but to spread the gospel. That's for God's glory, and that's for the benefit of the world, not for our personal benefit. But following God's will is always that way. We need to be committed to God's will, not our well-being. Now, the second problem that these leaders had was they were focused on not on God's power, but on their puniness. But if we're going to trust God against all odds, we need to have our eyes on God, not on ourselves or the enemy, or how competent we are in relation to our enemy, or to our how big the obstacle is versus how small our resources are, or whatever. These leaders, their focus was on themselves, or on the enemy, not on God. It says in 13:28, "Nevertheless, the people who live in the land are strong. and their cities are fortified and very large. And then later on it says in verse 31, the men who had gone up with him said, we're not able to go against the people, for they are too strong for us. And then in verse 33, that famous line, we saw the Nephilim, the sons of Anak, very, very large people. And it says, and we became like grasshoppers in our own sight. And so we were in their sight. Their eyes were on the enemy, the obstacle, which the people of Canaan were the obstacle to taking the land. And their eyes were also on their own resources. Okay? But that's never going to take us, cause us or bring us to a place of trust against great odds. We need to have our focus on God like Caleb and Joshua did, not on the obstacles and the enemies like the leaders of Israel had. Now, the third problem that they experienced was they were, instead of being assured by God's promise, they were looking for assurance from their own abilities. But what should have been the greatest assurance was God's promise. God had made so many promises. He had promised Abraham the land. He had promised Abraham a great many descendants. He had promised these particular Israelites to bring them out of the promised land. He's fulfilled everything, every promise, with the exception of taking them into the land and giving it to them. That's what's next. But instead of being assured by their promise, they were looking for assurance by having a sense of competence in themselves. But listen, that's never a recipe for God getting the glory for the work that we do for him. God had them right where he wanted them. He wanted them to realize that these people were way beyond their ability to take over. He wanted them to have their trust in him and him alone. Now the last thing, and I think this is an important point as well, is if we're going to trust God against all odds, the one thing we do need to be afraid of is God's displeasure. Not the enemy's threat, but God's displeasure. Notice what Joshua said to them in Numbers 14, 9. He says, only do not rebel against the Lord, and do not fear the people of the land. We need to be afraid of rebelling against God, not against paying the cost of obeying God. If we're going to be afraid of anything, let's be afraid of incurring God's judgment or God's discipline, of displeasing our Heavenly Father. Let's be afraid of that, but let's never be afraid of the enemy who we should see as already a defeated foe. When God is leading us, he's going to take us in. He's going to take us to where he wants us to go, and he's going to give us success in all that he calls us to do. Friend, trust God. Don't keep your eyes on the enemies and the obstacles and the challenges. Get your eyes on God. He can do anything. Well, that's this lesson from Numbers 13 and 14, trusting God against all odds, and I pray that's exactly what you'll do. God bless you.